Hi, this is Dr. Cairns with a brief lecture on equity theory and how that relates to compensation, and then the Fair Labor Standards Act minimum wage and overtime provisions. This information is obtained through the SHRM module, compensation and benefits. So equity theory, something all of you are familiar with from some of your other courses. You've been exposed to this aspect of the theory that is essentially where a person perceives an inequity. That person's going to be motivated either to reduce or eliminate the tension and perceived inequity. So they may withdraw some of their work and effort if they perceive there's an inequity. And inequities can exist from the standpoint of externally how that person's job compares and pay rate compares to other organizations outside of that company doing the same job. And so within, say, the same industry. And then you have an internal equity, which is how fair is that person's job pay compared to other jobs in the organization. And this can be similar jobs or it could be different jobs. So an organization needs to examine these equity issues, and they can do so by performing market pay surveys, trying to see how their rates compare to other companies in the same market, perhaps region, even locally, nationally, even globally. And then you have an internal comparison, looking at how through job evaluation and that where the jobs compare and how the pays levels are for similar jobs or different jobs. And so before we leave this, though, I want to have pictured here is the signing of the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009. And this comes into play from the standpoint that while this gives people an opportunity within 180 days of learning about a pay inequity or what they may perceive as an equity, the right to sue. So that's something and an aspect to also for companies to consider when it comes to this whole question of equity theory and how it ties into motivating employees, but also into legal aspects as well. And then let's take a brief look at the Fair Labor Standards Act and some of the provisions there. And we've talked a little bit about that previously in the establishment of the federal minimum wage. And obviously there's been a lot of discussion with that because the minimum wage has not been increased in a number of years. And there's a lot of local activity happening at a state and local level doing so, but nothing has happened on a federal level outside of those mandates that were signed into executive order by President Obama covering federal contractors. There's also the aspect of exempt employees where they were not required to be paid overtime, and the threshold was changed and the rules for that were changed, and that's been challenged in the courts as to whether or not the Department of Labor had the right to change the rules and the parameters that governed whether or not someone who is determined to be an exempt employee would receive overtime compensation. You'll see embedded in the law the actual how it's calculated, and that's where the argument comes from. So that's this week, looking at equity theory and compensation and fair labor standards as it relates to minimum wage and overtime provisions.